First of all, thanks very much. Good morning. Thanks for joining the National Breeding Hen Harrier Survey workshop. I guess over the next 40 or 45 minutes, I'll just be going into a bit more detail as to what the survey entails, a bit about Hen Harrier ecology, and then we'll turn our focus onto the recording forms and the square allocations. So it's one stage. Once you reach the point we're talking about the squares, if anyone who's interested in getting a square allocated can put their details and the preferred area or square in the chat. And if there is any questions as we work through the slides, please put them in the Q&A box, and then we can answer them at the end. We will be showing a map at the end which shows the currently allocated squares. I guess the first workshop was last Tuesday, and from that point we had started to allocate squares to people who'd expressed interest. So some of the squares maybe that you would prefer might not be available, but we hope that there will be an adjacent square that you can maybe take on. Okay. Okay, so the Hen Harrier Survey has a number of aims. One is to obtain a reliable population estimate for the Republic of Ireland, and it follows on from previous national surveys which started in 2000 and every 5 years since. Due to the pandemic, we were unable to undertake the 2020 scheduled survey, and a large part to this survey is being able to estimate the change in the population in intervening years and establish a kind of population trend. All this data that's collected as part of the survey goes to informing conservation measures, and there's a number of things ongoing at the moment, specifically for Hen Harrier, and that is the Hen Harrier Threat Response Plan, which has been in prep since 2013. So we are at the latter stages of that plan, and it has been developed by National Parks and Wildlife Service. But the data that we collect this year will hopefully inform future interventions. So the survey is also needed because the population of Hen Harrier has been in sharp decline, and we've lost more than half our breeding population in the last 40 or 50 years as the landscape and their breeding habitats has changed. Because of that decline, the Hen Harrier is afforded strict protection under the Birds Directive and is listed on Annex 1, and is also considered a all-island species of conservation concern. A bit of background, well, the Hen Harrier was widespread in Ireland, and one of the main atlases in 1968 to 1972 estimated that the population was between 200 to 300 pairs, and would have occupied places, especially in the East Coast and Wicklow, and had many strongholds through to the South Midlands, with scattered populations in the Northwest. If we fast forward to the last national survey in 2015, that picture is quite bleak. The population now stands at maybe 108 confirmed pairs, with possibly up to an extra 40 odd territorial pairs on top of that. And the range has become quite severely contracted in places, and those strongholds have kind of shrunk into the South Midwest regions, with an increase in population seen in South Donegal, Tyrone border, and also the Leitrim uplands as well. So we're seeing this kind of flux and change over time, where certain areas are losing their populations and certain areas are becoming more important. So an updated survey will hopefully try and plug some of the gaps in our understanding as where Hen Harriers are breeding and in what numbers. So overall, the last survey in 2015 produced this interesting contrast map between 2005 and 2015, and it did show these hotspots where populations had shrunk and where gains had been made, and some of that is quite concerning because a number of the special protection areas for Hen Harrier overlap these areas where these populations have collapsed. So overall, between 2000 and 2015, there was a third population decline. So a bit about the ecology of Hen Harrier and its identification. I do appreciate that there'll be lots of people on the workshop today who have done the survey before, and we will be familiar with Hen Harriers under ecology. But I guess this workshop caters for people who are maybe new to the survey and taking on a square for the first time. So I'll try and keep that kind of a bit broad. So a bit of identification. This is the male and female, male on the left. And there is a slight sexual dimorphism there, where the females are slightly larger than the males. These are both adults, and the adult male is a lovely blue silver with black wingtips, and the female is more camouflaged and cryptic with this kind of brown, darker plumage and barred tail feathers and wing feathers. Young birds are very similar to the females, and they don't lose that kind of young plumage for a number of years. In males, it might take them maybe 3 to 4 years to become that blue colour. But you'll notice the adults in this picture have yellow eyes, and that's a feature that's different to immature or juvenile birds which have darker eyes. But collectively, juveniles and adult females are called ringtails. A bit of a closer look tells you a bit more about what the Hen Harrier is designed to do, and it is a bird of open habitats, specialised for predating small birds and small mammals. And a look at the head will show this kind of owl-like ear disc, which tells you that not only are they excellent hunters by sight, but sound is very important as well for locating small mammals in the undergrowth. So the survey squares, as part of this survey, we aim to cover all suitable habitat within a 10-kilometre square, and basically we want to determine what the occupancy of those squares is. What's really important in this survey is that we're in late March at the moment, and this is when Hen Harriers are going to be most active in establishing those territories. So those early visits are extremely important from now on. So the type of breeding habitat, traditionally Hen Harriers would nest on the ground in rank heather moorland, and we also have this kind of upland pastures, mosaic of acid grassland and heather with some willow salix scrub. Their breeding ecology is quite different from in Britain, where it's mostly kind of heather dominated areas that are selected for nesting. But in Ireland, the landscape has changed so much in terms of overgrazing, burning and forestry that Hen Harriers have become adaptable. So they will nest in a whole range of different habitats and uplands. Other habitats that are important during the breeding season for foraging and even nesting is rank grassland or Millennia meadows with lots of scrub. So upland wet pastures. A lot of the uplands now have been afforested, and Hen Harriers over the last 40, 50 years have selected to nest in free-thicket plantation forestry. So with this habitat occurs in your square, targeting pre-thicket growth types are the kind of habitats we'd find breeding Hen Harrier. So a bit about their breeding season. Well, this time of year, it's all about males getting onto territory and displaying themselves to females. And they do this through an elaborate sky dance, where they rise high in the air and then drop down to the ground and repeat this undulating flight and display until they either get noticed by a female and get paired up. Females can take part in sky dancing, and this can take place between mid-March to May. And I guess if you have a breezy day where it's quite sunny, these are the best times to see the males and sometimes females sky dancing. And it's usually an indication that this is the chosen nest site. So if you see a male sky dancing, it's a very clear indication that he's over the centre of the territory. Nest building occurs from April to mid-May, and it's a very kind of sparse nest on the ground in between rank vegetation or scrub or heather. And it's just usually heather twigs arranged quite loosely and then kind of lined with purple moorgrass. Egg laying occurs usually round about the first week in May, but can occur either side or later. And even if pairs try to establish a nest and then fail and move, then the laying period can be a bit later. There's usually 3 to 5 eggs laid, and these are laid at 48-hour intervals. Incubation is done solely by the female, and usually between late April to late June. The incubation period is between 29 to 31 days. And because the eggs are laid in sequence, the chicks hatch at different times. One key behaviour around the nest, because the male is quite noticeable, he usually brings in food and passes it to the female in midair, and it's called a food pass. Now, while she's incubating, he's the sole provider of food. So usually he'll come in with food and he'll call to the female, this high-pitched kind of whistle, and then the female will come off the nest, fly slightly away, and then they'll pass the food in midair. And I guess that has evolved to avoid detection from predators. And the males very rarely come into the nest, even when providing food at the later chick stage. So nest protection and provisioning, this is usually between mid-May to late August. And the female broods the chicks for the first kind of 15 or so days until the chicks are large enough to regulate their own temperature. And then the female goes off to forage for food with the male. Once both birds are provisioning the chicks, the chick growth is very fast. So they'll lose that downy feathers and grow their first flight feathers pretty quickly. And the chicks are ready to fledge usually between 30 to 40 days. They can stay within the nesting area after they fledge, and they're still provided with food by both parents. The mean fledgling period is therefore July to late August. So what does this survey involve? Well, as I mentioned, it's suitable habitat within the survey squares, and there's a minimum of 3 visits required throughout the breeding season to try and detect occupancy or evidence of breeding. So between late March and the end of July. And in cases where there are active nests, it's really important that we get a 4th visit to try and establish what that breeding outcome is, whether it's successful or failed, or even a rough estimate as to the number of fledged chicks that are seen in the nest area. So how do we survey? Well, it's one method, and that is from a vantage point, and the watches from vantage points are between 2.5 to 3 hours. And at vantage points, it's important that you are discreet and you reduce the risk of disturbance. And it's recommended that you watch an active nest location from more than 500 metres away. But we'll touch on some of the issues around vantage points and disturbance later. Okay. The aim of the survey is to gain the highest level of evidence of breeding within each square. And we have a certain number of criteria which must be met from observations during the survey. Confirmed breeding is where you have observed a food pass or adults with prey coming into the nest, or where you have adults that are agitated and clearly feel threatened and are protecting young birds. A possible breeding pair would be where you have seen sky dancing in the area and you've seen the pair in suitable nesting habitat during a key part of the breeding period, mid-May to the end of June. But you haven't seen any evidence. The last category is where a bird is seen, where it's just a single adult outside of mid-May to the end of June. So the surveys take place, usually overlapping these periods of increased activity. So during periods of sky dancing, during when the males are food passing to females, which gives away nest locations, and also when the parents are more active coming and going with food. So each survey visit to your square of suitable habitat should be during these key periods to increase your chance of detecting birds. So your survey visits are broken down roughly into these time periods. The first visit is between now and the middle of April, and then a second visit between mid-April and mid-May. It doesn't matter if you don't see birds on the first visit or even the second visit. It is still important to go back and do that minimum of the third one, purely because the birds aren't always going to be active, and especially during that first and second period. It could be that only the male would be visible within a territory and providing food only once or twice during the day. So it's important to continue. So both the first and second visit are to identify that the site is actually occupied by hen harriers. The third visit is to establish the location of active nests. And the fourth is to confirm the breeding outcome. A little point about expectations if you're undertaking the survey for the first time. It will take a lot of patience, and there may be cases where you're watching suitable habitat and you're not seeing anything at all. And it's very easy to become a bit despondent and jack it in early and go off and do something else. But even in occupied territories, the activity can be quite low during the start of the season. So please persevere. Also, in terms of expectations of what you might see, the photograph on the left is taken by a professional photographer who spent an awful lot of time scoping out birds and where they move to and been able to get these pictures. We all see these fantastic images on the internet about food passes and sky dancing, but this isn't the view that you're going to get through binoculars. It's going to be something probably much more like this. If you're in a good VP and you're discreet and the birds aren't being threatened or changing their behaviour in response to you. So this is a male from distance flying over some scrub, or maybe a ringtail harrier foraging over some grassland. So it's important to know before you start the survey, most of your views will be short, probably maybe a few seconds to a few minutes, and at distance. Survey coverage required. It is a colossal undertaking to cover nationally all the places where hen harrier are breeding or potentially breeding. Even though their range has contracted over the last 15-20 years, their distribution is quite widespread. So as part of the survey, we have 327 10-kilometre squares to survey. And in 2015, that took around about 259 surveyors going out, recording casual sightings, surveying suitable habitat in 10-kilometre squares. So it's a huge amount of administration and a huge amount of time spent by National Park staff and volunteers. In terms of survey coverage, we're very lucky to have the Hen Harrier Project Agri-Environment Scheme, which undertakes annual monitoring in the Special Protection Area Network for Hen Harrier, which covers 9 counties and 6 SPAs. So as part of the survey, they have partnered up with us and the National Parks and BirdWatch and the Golden Eagle Trust, and they're going to provide the survey data from 55 10-kilometre squares. The squares are also allocated in terms of priority to National Parks and Wildlife staff, and we've started that process already. And the remainder of the squares will go to Raptor Group field workers, volunteers, and BirdWatch Ireland volunteers as well. So a bit of context, this is a much better map, maybe show you some places for points of reference. So there are quite a number of squares in Wicklow and clumped together in Leitrim, Tyrone, Donegal, but the vast bulk of them run from Laois Offaly all the way down to the southwest and Kerry Cork border, with a few scattered squares in Waterford. There's also a stronghold of squares in County Clare. So what will happen if you decide to take on a square? Well, we will send you a map of 10-kilometre square, a survey guide with the methods, which are kind of summarised from this workshop today, and also how to fill in the recording form and a copy of the recording form, both in Excel spreadsheet and a printable one for writing in the field. The next stage, we'll talk about the recording form itself. This is the most important part of the survey because it provides us with all the data and information that gets pumped into these positive conservation efforts at the end. And it is quite a detailed survey. It is important to know that all this is available online, and I'll give you the website and details of how to upload your information via email, through the website, or online submission. So this is the recording form. It might look a bit complicated, but we'll work through the codes, and after a couple of Vantage points, you'll become very familiar with it and it'll become a lot easier. First thing is basic information: name, contact details, the observation type. So is that casual sighting or is it a timed vantage point watch? What's the location of the watch? What is the 10k square, the county, or the townland or area name? And also, if you are lucky enough to get an awful lot of activity, lots of birds in the one place, and you're using several pages or even several maps, please make sure they are numbered as multiple sheets so we can keep track of them. What's important in the recording form is all observed activities, threats and pressures within 500 metres of where you're watching, and also within the wider landscape at maybe a 2 kilometre range. There's a whole list of codes in the methods and on the recording form, which you can populate onto the sheet. And cases might be burning, forestry operations, agriculture, recreational disturbance. And each of those will have a code. So if you just put the code into the recording form, any time that you witness or observe during a survey, and all that information collectively gives us a chance to create an index of pressures and threats that was done in 2015. And all this was analysed in the last survey and is available in the Irish Wildlife Manual number 93. So it's really beneficial. It kind of provides this picture of what the hen harrier is dealing with within its landscape. Not only is habitat scarce, the right type of habitat is hard to find. Good places to catch prey are fragmented in the landscape. There's an awful lot of predation pressure from foxes and pine marten. And also these birds are hassled by corvids. They have all these things going against them. And when we have this information on threats and pressures, it tells us an awful lot about the landscape and why they're struggling to hold on in certain areas. So please include that information when you can. Other basic information is, well, what visit number is it? Is it your first, second, third or fourth? The date. The vantage point location is important. We bring all this into a GIS system, and it allows us to look at not only the vantage points and areas covered, but also the areas where the birds are found. Start and end times of the watch also gives us a clear indication of what the survey effort is like, and allows us to total that up over the whole survey to get an idea of what kind of effort was involved to get the detection of birds. So sightings information, this is extremely important. We would like the grid reference of the activity. So if a bird is flying down a hillside and you've spotted it, you record it on your form. If you can make an estimate of where the midpoint of that activity was on the flight line and mark it on the map. Also, if you can provide information on the number of birds you're seeing, if you can sex them, please put that in the form as well. So behaviour is extremely important. It tells us an awful lot about what the birds are doing and why, and it links in directly to this highest evidence of breeding activity. So there's a number of codes we would like to use in the recording forms. So for example, if you can see on the screen, I know it's quite small font, display, so sky dancing, aerial displays, food passes, FP, hunting, an H, flying, alarm calls, a bird with prey, soaring, circling. So if you can capture that information for each sighting, that would be great. Onto the habitat codes, this is also equally as important because it tells us how they're using the landscape and how that's changed over time. And the amount of data that's been amassed in previous surveys allows us to maybe compare how that landscape's changed and maybe how they're faring. So habitat code 1F, this is first rotation pre-thicket forestry plantation. And this is a habitat that hen harriers will select to nest in. It's usually trees that are still able to accommodate foraging and nesting hen harriers. So anything less than maybe 10 years would be considered pre-thicket from a hen harrier point of view. Habitat code 2F, this is a second rotation pre-thicket forestry. It's sometimes difficult to tell from what's first and second, but usually a closer look will show maybe some brash or remains of harvested trees in second rotation pre-thicket. And this is a habitat that also hen harriers select to nest in. Usually have like more of a scrubby, brashy layer as well. So T would be for thicket, so this is where plantation conifer has closed over and it's of no use for nesting or foraging for hen harrier. Usually it's over 10 years old and has no shrub layer, except there may be rides in between these plantation blocks that hen harriers will use to forage along and even nest in. CF is for clearfell, and this is rather obvious. It's where there's been harvested forestry and all that brash and stumps have just been left. Code H is for heather moorland. So this is where there's hill slopes or uplands where heather is a dominant vegetation. It can include patches of purple moorgrass as well, and usually it's quite extensively grazed. And this is the kind of traditional, more natural habitat that you would find hen harriers foraging in and nesting in, especially in places where that heather is much older growth. These are excellent nest sites and should be checked as part of the survey. Habitat code G, so this could include a number of grassland types, but mostly in uplands, and where you'll find hen harriers foraging will be acid grassland. So this is mostly kind of millennial purple moorgrass, and might include some wet seeps where there's bog myrtle, or mosaics of heath and bog. And these types of habitats are really important for skylarks and meadow pipits, which are the predominant prey of hen harrier in Ireland. So these are worth keeping an eye on in the survey. Rough grassland is also really important for foraging. And this kind of vegetation structure of tussocky rushes not only provides really good opportunities for hen harrier to ambush prey, but also provides protection and is a source for small mammals and small birds. Rough grazing is also really important during winter, and in some cases you might find where birds breed during the summer, there's also maybe some important roosting places nearby. So this is where there's unenclosed fields, wet pasture, wet grassland that's kind of low grazing intensity, and the rushes have kind of closed in slightly. IG is for improved grazing. This is typically a habitat that hen harriers will avoid, but usually they can skirt along the hedgerows or cross these fields, and this is where wet pasture has been drained, reseeded or improved and is under intense grazing management, usually by sheep or cattle. LR is for linear features, and these from a hen harrier point of view are really important. So we're thinking about small streams or gullies or ditches or lines of scrub, almost into full-grown hedgerows. And you will find hen harriers moving along these linear features to try and spook and flush small birds and mammals. And they'll have that kind of characteristic low gliding V-shaped flight as they move along these linear rides and ditches. The landscape that hen harriers are in does have a mix of kind of intensive and extensive farmland with lots of different hedgerows, and hedgerows are really important. So even where this might look quite intensive, you would find hen harriers moving between areas along hedgerows. So it's something to keep a lookout for. Habitat code S is for scrub. Scrub is also extremely important for nesting, and even small pockets of scrub within a landscape hen harriers will select to nest in. And these range from hillsides full of gorse or briars, or even kind of more natural scrub like willow in amongst heather. An important part of the survey is to get the most out of it we can, especially if you're spending time watching. There are other surveys that the national parks are coordinating just now, and their staff are involved in surveying for red grouse and golden plover. So during the survey, it would be good if you record on the form other birds of conservation concern. These target birds are raptors and owls, breeding waders, and any other upland birds of conservation concern. And some examples of these would be curlew especially. There's an awful lot of effort at the moment in curlew conservation. So as a priority, if you do find curlew during any of your watches, please get in touch with Dr. Barry Donoghue or us, and we can send that on in real time. The codes for these other bird species are on the recording form. Okay, so a bit of prep for the first visit. Anytime now into mid-April, you'll be out doing that first survey. So when you get your map, you'll have to decide on where you're going to watch. Probably most of you who have done the survey before will have the same square, and you'll know where to go. But if it's a square for the first time, it's important to try and get a good vantage point with panoramic views of the suitable habitat. And as the season progresses, you can change your vantage points depending on what activity you're picking up on. So my advice would be to start quite broadly at a vantage point where you have a wide area to view. And if you are picking up birds, then you can maybe use your initiative and change the vantage point to maybe see where the birds are moving and coming from. Habitats to exclude from the survey: don't waste your time in built-up areas or areas that are maybe 100 metres from occupied farms. Improved pasture isn't suitable. It doesn't provide any food, so hen harriers are unlikely to use it. They're only going to be seen flying across it. So avoid those areas. Avoid closed canopy plantation forestry as well. And even where there is heath and bog, if it's overgrazed and degraded, it's unlikely going to be supporting birds during the breeding season. Places to target, like we talked about in the slides. Open heather moorland would be the preferred. So this is dominated by heather cover. Even well drained or old cut heather would be quite important. Slopes and river valleys, and upland plantation forestry, either first or second rotation, but certainly in that early pre-thicket stage. A vantage point. One thing to note is disturbance. We did mention earlier in the workshop that it's advised to keep 500 metres at least away from a nest site, and the birds will be quite different depending where you are, and they will be maybe acclimatised or not to people. So it's important to realise that the hen harrier, the bird you're watching, is protected all year round, and it would be an offence to recklessly disturb a nest of a hen harrier. It's important that because of these vantage points and you're seeing birds, there's always a temptation to try and get closer or get some good photographs, but you will need a licence to do photography, and you will need to apply in writing to the department and specify what area. And in some cases, the time lag to actually get your licence could be 4 to 6 weeks or longer. It's important to bear in mind that even if you do apply for a licence, you might not get it. There is no requirement to visit nests as part of the survey. Any intrusive methods into the nest isn't required. We don't need to know number of eggs, clutch size, any of that. So it's important that it's just vantage watches from a distance. It's important that not to be standing out in the open, because you will be noticed in a lot of these kind of remote places. So if you do have a vantage point in your car, you can stay in the car. If there's patches of scrub where you are concealed, it's good to maybe find those kind of places and be discreet. A bit about disturbance. Well, I guess it just depends what kind of disturbance that is. There's disturbance that's prolonged over a long period, and it's a sensitive time in the breeding season where the female's flushed off a nest with eggs and the weather's not great. Those eggs can chill really quickly, or the nest can become abandoned. If the disturbance is short and the adults are maybe put off from bringing in food, obviously that has an impact on chick health and welfare. A lot of the published work on disturbance shows that birds can show a reaction from an intruder from maybe 10 metres or maybe 1.5 kilometres away. So it's important to keep that in mind. Even though you might think you might be quite some distance away, you could be causing some residual disturbance or affecting their behaviour. So that safe buffer is between 500 to 750 metres away. So you might need a good pair of binoculars or optics. Always think about the bird and put it first. Always back off if you think that the behaviour of the bird is telling you you're an issue. So one way to know is that the male usually, if the nest is occupied and the female is on it, the male will usually hang back at quite a high distance and just observe you and give off this kind of chuckling noise. And that's usually a sign to tell the female that, you know, there's a threat here, to stay down. As soon as you hear that, it's a good chance that you should move away from the area straight away, because he's just going to be focused on you until you leave. It is very good news from a survey point of view because it confirms everything you're looking for. It confirms that he has something to protect, he's agitated, and the territory is active. What you should do is just leave. You can maybe come back a few hours later, further away, and a more kind of discreet distance and observe, or come back the next day. Either way, that male knows you're there, and he's not going to carry on with his business until you're gone. So please bear that in mind. In terms of vantage points and private property, there is no right to roam in Ireland. So please be conscious of where you're going, stick to roads and trackways if you can. Being part of the survey and getting the recording form and taking part doesn't give you a right just to go into any private property in pursuit of a vantage point or the birds themselves. And if you are speaking to locals or landowners, please be courteous. Please give as much information about what you're doing to promote the survey. Also bear in mind, a lot of this information is confidential and sensitive. So don't be giving too much information about the locations of nests if you know them. And also bear in mind the landowner will probably know the birds are there anyway. So visit 2. Sure, visit 1 you might not find anything, but it's important to go back to visit 2 mid-April to late May. And on the agenda, you're still wanting to confirm occupancy. And this second visit should ideally be done 2 weeks after the first visit. Recording methods as before, and also covering the same suitable habitats that you've selected from your map as before. And during the second visit, you're looking for those food passes. So mid-April to late May, eggs should have been laid, and the male should be coming in with food for the female. On to visit 3, late May to late June, and you're hoping to confirm there's an actual nest and chicks in the nest. Same recording, the same information, threats and pressures. Cover the same areas. And during this time, you're watching not only for those food passes, but also the females a bit more active, bringing in food. And if you can find the male or the female with food, you're really wanting to track them back to a central nest location while being discreet. Visit 4, so you have an active nest, and maybe over a number of days, you're coming back and you're keeping tabs. You want to confirm the outcome. You want to confirm that nest has been successful or it's failed. There is a high chance that active nests will fail. Hen harriers breeding in Ireland do have a very high failure rate, and those failures do become more pronounced as the chicks become more noisy and much bigger, and the nest starts to smell. So there will be cases if you do come across active nests. Be prepared for a bit of disappointment that those nests might not be successful. But it's extremely important we know this information. It tells us a lot. So you can stop each survey after the nest is confirmed. There's no point staying there for 3 hours or 2.5 hours. If you've got to a vantage point and you've confirmed a sky dance or any of those key behaviours, or that the nest is still active, you don't have to stay and do the full 3 hours. You've got your information, it's on the form, onto the next site or onto your next square. Especially in visit 4, you're looking for fledged young, so it might take a bit of time to watch to see if you've got birds in and around the nest site and still being provisioned. Okay, a bit about the data entry. This is the most important bit. And if you are taking on lots of vantage points, and appreciate that you are doing this in your own time or part of other work duties, one thing we would ask is that as soon as a survey is done, if you can send it to us as quickly as possible. It's very easy to forget about it and put it in a pile, and then you leave it to the end. And if you leave it to the end, it puts you under a bit of pressure. There's lack of motivation to do it, and it has a knock-on effect for us, the organisers, because it takes us a lot longer to go through it, quality check it, collate it all at the end, and then provide that end product, that report, to national parks. So if you could, please do send in information as and when it's finished, or as soon as possible afterwards. You can send it by post if you prefer. If you're not tech savvy, that's no problem. You can send that to one of our regional coordinators, and the information of those is on our website, www.irishhenharriersurvey.com. We have three regional kind of coordinators at the moment who are taking in the forms. We will also have another 2 regional coordinators covering different parts of the country. So there's 3 people you can send information to, myself, John Lusby of BirdWatch Ireland, the Raptor officer there, and Mark Ruddock of the Golden Eagle Trust, and their contact details are on the website. Our other 2 regional coordinators are Frank Conley down in the southwest in Kerry and Cork, and also Lorcan O'Toole in the northwest, Donegal and Leitrim. So you can send by email to any of the email addresses there, but our preference and the easiest way would be online at the website. And there's a whole range of different options that you can click. You can enter online data submission portal, you can enter a casual sighting, you can download the spreadsheet or any of that information. Please don't hesitate to contact us either by phone or email. The next part of the workshop, we're going to be talking about squares. We have been actively allocating them. So the maps are going to show now are the squares that are currently available. And if you can put your details of the square and your email address in the chat, and if you have any questions in the Q&A, we can answer the questions afterwards. So to the north of the country, the squares that are hatched at the moment have been allocated. And as you can see, there's still quite a lot that are available, especially in and around Leitrim and the Sligo border. So if there are any volunteers around there or other people you might think might be interested, please let them know about the survey. South East Donegal and the Tyrone border, and also up in the Inishowen Peninsula, does need a bit of volunteer effort. Also, North East Louth would be one of our kind of pinch points at the moment. Onto the south of the country, there's a large number of squares that need to be covered in the South Midlands and also in the Wicklow Mountains as well. And there are still quite a few squares in County Clare. So if you can help at all take on a square, it would be really appreciated. So please let us know and we can get you set up as soon as possible. Okay, thanks very much for your time. And I think we will try and answer the questions that have been submitted. So I'll maybe hand you over to Mark or John.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ryan. That was fantastic and well done. I think it gives a really good overview of the survey, the background to the survey, and what's involved in the survey. So hopefully any of you that are new to the survey now know what's involved, and if you are hopefully still keen on taking on a square or assisting with a square, then as Ryan said, please do enter your details into the chat and make sure to include your email address as well as either the square details or the general area that you can operate in. And also important as well, there might be some surveyors which may not feel confident to take on a square themselves. So if that's the case, then please do say that, and we can look at matching up surveyors to ensure that those that maybe have less experience are matched up with those that have more experience. So if you want to, I'm not sure, Ryan, if you can put back up the map so people can be looking at that and entering the square details in the chat. And while you're doing that, we'll go through the questions in the Q&A. And Mark, feel free to jump in at any stage. So, some of the questions. So Jamie Durant asked about the timing of survey visits, so the time during the day, and that's a really good question. So essentially, you want to time the visits to coincide with the peak periods of activity of the birds, obviously to give stand the best chance of detecting them. So that's typically in the morning and in the evening, and it's to typically avoid the midday lull in activity. So, but obviously as the season goes on and as the prey requirements for the young in the nest increase, then the birds can be active right throughout the day. But to give the best chance, it's best to time the surveys in the morning and in the evening. Margot Perel asks about the size of breeding territories. How big and wide can breeding territories be? That's a really good question as well. And It's something that we have some information on in terms of hen harrier home range size in the Irish context, but that information is quite limited, and it's informed by GPS or satellite tagging of birds to look at their movements during the breeding season. And what that has showed is that birds can move over quite substantial distances. So there was a breeding male hen harrier that was recorded up to 11 kilometres from the nest site, which is obviously quite a substantial distance. But typically the movements would be more, the home range size would be smaller. So most of the foraging movements, most of the movements of the birds during the breeding season would be within a few kilometres, within say 4 kilometres. But that's not to say the birds can't venture beyond that and can't have foraging trips beyond that as well.
Yeah, just typically though, John, I was just going to maybe add that typically females will move round about 2 to 3 kilometers from nest sites, but the males, as John said, would be much wider, 10, 15 kilometers. So it can be important in deciphering your sightings as to where that bird originates from. So yes, using that understanding, and it's really important to sort of try and track birds and follow birds as to where they're going from, or either going to or coming from, just so that you can establish the origin of a nest site. And one of the key things is always to look at their feet. If they are carrying food, that's a real indication that they're en route to a female or to a nest site, particularly when you see males, and really keeping a good eye on their feet as to whether or not they're carrying something.
Can I just add as well, John and Mark, how big the territories can be. It's also important to know that pairs can nest quite close to each other. So even though you might have struck gold and you found a nest and you're seeing lots of activity, it could mean that there's a nest actually quite close by. So never automatically assume it's just one pair. Where the habitat's good, there's lots of prey. I think even Mark, in the last couple of years from the SPA monitoring, you do find areas where hen harriers can be within a few or 500 metres of each other. Would you agree?
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And to not assume that if you do pick up a pair within a 10-kilometre square, that's the only pair, and to sit back and enjoy watching that pair. There could be, and obviously some of the key squares, the priority squares, have obviously several pairs nesting in them. So no, that's a really good point. And it's great to see there's loads coming in there to the chat. And again, if you could ensure to put the square preferences in the chat, and then any questions you have in the Q&A box, both of which are at the bottom of your screens there, just to try and streamline, because the loads coming in is great. So I'll just continue on through the questions coming in. So the next one is from Jamil, hopefully I've pronounced your name right. And it's about the asks, can we clarify about the NPWS license required for photography? So essentially for bird photography for birds during the breeding season in or close to the nest requires a specific license, and all the details is on the National Parks and Wildlife Service website. And there's a specific form. It's called Section 22. This particular license for photography. So it's so if you visit the National Parks and Wildlife Service website, and you'll see that form, and that's required then to fill it out and return to National Parks and Wildlife Service, and they're assessed. Each of those license applications are assessed and then granted or otherwise, or sometimes granted with conditions. And it's to ensure that that if you are intending on photographing birds during the breeding season, that you're aware of the disturbance issues, obviously to avoid disturbance. So you can get all that information on the National Parks and Wildlife Service website. Michael McGrath asks, can we download or get a link to watch this again, to watch the workshop again? And yes, you can. I'm not sure, Ryan, if the initial workshop was recorded, wasn't it? It's not yet up on the website, is it?
Yeah, the first one was recorded. I think it's just a case of providing a link to that. It's something we'll organise over the next.
Yeah, we will do that. So if you keep an eye on the website, Michael, that the workshop will be up, and that will be available as a resource to watch anytime you want. And Margot asks, can online data entry be filled in and saved after each visit or only at the end of the survey? It can be filled in using the website, yes. So there's an online data entry portal, and that can be entered after each survey visit, and that's good for us as well, because we can keep an eye then on one of the pinch points of the survey is if there's and a really important point is that the sooner we get the data in at the end of the survey, the easier it is for us, and because you know, we can start then looking at the picture on a national scale and looking at trends on a national scale. But we can only do that once we have all the information in. So that's really important to get the information in, and we have the I think it's the 15th of August is the cutoff point, Mark, is it, for the deadline for all data entry?
31st of August 31st. Is the deadline. I've in the chat I've shared the data submission page on the website, and if people want to go in and browse that, the recording forms, the description of the methods are all available for download on that particular page, and there's also then 2 tabs that you can press for either entering casual sightings. These all link to an Esri app known as Survey 123. You can submit casual sightings, and you can also digitize your field sightings on an ongoing basis. If you have the link on your phone or anything like that, you'll be able to even fill in those on a daily basis, and that'll keep everything going. So you can do that, or some people prefer to fill in the paper records. There's downloadable forms for using in the field, and then it would help either to put those into Excel or put them into that online Esri form, and all of the forms just match what's on the paper forms, so it's quite easy to do that. So I've put the link in for the data submission page, and you'll see there the ability to download the information for the survey, the recording forms, and where to enter all your data as well.
Yep, that's great. And next question, Porrick Webb asks, how many vantage points should be used in any one 10-kilometre square? He says, the square that I've chosen is suitable heather and immature forestry breeding habitat, but is interspersed with lots of mature forestry and unsuitable farmland. What would be the best approach? Yeah, so that's a really good question. So essentially, the number of vantage points is dictated by the quantity of suitable habitat, and essentially it's there has to be enough vantage points to be able to confidently cover all the available suitable breeding habitat. So you could get a survey square which has very little suitable breeding habitat, a small pocket of breeding habitat, and it might be possible to cover that with a single vantage point. But then equally, if you have a survey square similar to what you described, Porrick, that there's a lot of potentially suitable breeding habitat that's interspersed, then obviously that requires more vantage points in order to be able to cover all of that breeding habitat confidently. So it very much comes down to the nature of the square and the quantity of suitable breeding habitat, with obviously the objective being to confidently cover all suitable breeding habitat. And I think that's where the first visits come in are really important, because obviously that does take some time to become familiar with the square and to identify the most suitable vantage point locations to cover that suitable breeding habitat. So definitely allow that time to familiarize yourself with the square and to identify the VP locations, the vantage point locations. But as Ryan said, then those vantage point locations can be adjusted over the course of the survey, as you build up information on the square and on the presence of birds in the square.
I would agree with John on that, and just reiterate that the next fortnight, in particular, wide vantage points to be able to see displaying males in particular, this particularly in weather conditions like we've had over the recent days. They do like that warmth and a bit of thermal, and the displaying in this early part of the year is really, really key to getting that. So nice wide vantage points, really, to try and start drilling down as to where they are. They can display within maybe 1 to 2 kilometers of an eventual nest site, but they'll usually be fairly close to that. So nice wide vantage points to begin with, and then as the season goes on, you'd start to maybe drill into closer areas of suitable habitat, where you think they may be coming from and going to be able to more accurately identify nest locations.
Yeah, that's great. And just to say there, Ryan, there's some people asking if it's possible to switch the map to the lower view there, just so people in the southern half of the country can have a look. Yeah. And I'll continue on with the Q&A in the meantime. Some really good questions coming in. So next is from Mike O'Connor. He asks, can you see where vantage points were in previous surveys, especially for less popular squares, and mentions R34. So the answer is yes, it is possible for us to provide the information from previous surveys in terms of the vantage point locations, but I would definitely include the caveat that we don't want to introduce bias in terms of just focusing on going back to the areas that were covered in the previous survey, because that was all the way back to 2015, and obviously there's potential for habitat to change over that period since the last survey, and particularly forest habitats. So it's so really important to kind of start from scratch, essentially from the first visit, to look and see where the suitable habitat is and where the vantage points are best selected over that suitable habitat. But it is possible for us to provide that information as a guide. Yes. And then Aoife Hughes asks, should we be looking for any particular weather conditions to survey in? So essentially, again, similar with the timing of survey visits, you want to choose the best conditions when the birds are most active to obviously increase the confidence in detecting them. And as Ryan mentioned, at the moment during the early stage of the breeding season, when birds are establishing territory, bright conditions with a bit of wind, that's really, really good conditions for sky dancing, and obviously, as Mark said, you can detect that from quite a distance away. So that is good weather conditions. But essentially, dry weather, and when I say windy, light kind of breeze, you don't want it kind of above force 5 in terms of wind conditions. They would be the optimal the optimal conditions. As well as that, you can again, it's to say, for example, on a day that there's the morning is wet and then it clears up, in the late morning or early afternoon. That's the time. It's very after heavy showers. We expect the birds then to be active thereafter, and therefore that's a good time to pick them up to increase detection. And I think that's all of the questions at the moment. Oh, sorry, another one from Margot. Do they nest mostly in the uplands, and what's the lowest altitude successful breeding pairs were recorded in Ireland? So yeah, typically you'd see there's a very strong correlation between upland areas and the breeding range of Hen Harrier, and typically they do nest in the uplands above 100 meters. But that's not to say that low-lying areas aren't suitable and shouldn't be considered as well. And looking at the map there, one of the maps that Ryan showed, there are Hen Harrier, even during the last survey, were recorded in squares, in quite low-lying areas, and even including raised bogs, so the likes of in Westmeath and also Roscommon. So if there's suitable habitat, it does require, we do need to focus on it. But typically birds would be in areas of 100 meters more in altitude.
I would agree with that, John. I think the lowest from memory, I think from 2015, was round about 80 meters above sea level for a nest site. But yes, if there's lowland sites, they can use scrub habitat, they can use lowland raised bogs. So we have had various records of that, and so I think it just really does, as John said, it just really does come down to the suitability of the habitat. But more typically, they do occur sort of over and above 100 meters plus, but they won't tend to go up very high. So 100 to maybe 400 meters above sea level. After that, and particularly around scree and rocky slopes, they don't like. So I think it is just being mindful. But if you've got a really deep patch of heather in some of those areas, you can get birds that obviously will select that habitat, and it comes down to the availability of the habitat in that particular area.
That's great. I'm just going through the chat at the moment, and most of them are requests for square allocations, which is great. So if there's any more questions there, I'll dig them up and respond them. And if anyone else has any more questions, please put it in the Q&A box. And just to say, on the survey square allocations, we won't be dealing with them directly today. It's because obviously it's an ongoing process in terms of allocating the squares. So that's something that we will. We'll get back to you on in terms of the square allocations, and at that point then provide the maps and the survey methods and all the requirements needed.
Absolutely, there's a good follow-up for all of us there. I wonder, Ryan, if you wanted to just flash up your internet just to show the website and just the drop downs on the different menus for a minute or two, and then I think we'll leave the chat open for another 5 minutes or so. If anybody's got any particular questions, we'll try and answer those, and then we'll close off the chat soon enough. There's a couple more questions coming in there. John, you were doing such a fantastic job. If you want to have a look at those.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks very much. So Hilary asks, well, when do you expect to provide allocations? So the survey square allocations. So we will essentially from today we'll be servicing those, but obviously there's a lot coming in, so it may take some time. But we would hope to get back to everyone by the end of this week with the survey square allocations. And for some of them, it does take us pairing surveyors up to cover squares, or we have some squares which are partially covered as it is. So there is some minor complexities, but by the end of this week we would hope to have got back to everybody here that has expressed an interest in taking on a square. And Aoife asks, you mentioned there had been declines within some SPAs and some other areas where the population has increased. Is there any factors that have been associated with the changes, particularly the increases, or are they just displaced breeding pairs from other areas? So yeah, that's a really good question, Aoife, and part of the reason as well that we, and it was really useful during the last survey, as well as this, surveyors recorded potential pressures and threats within the survey areas that they were covering. And that gives us a good idea as to what potential pressures and threats are acting on hen harrier populations in these areas, in both the SPA network and in and the wider countryside and outside the SPA network. So one of the main pressures on hen harrier populations is both within the SPA network and outside the SPA network is afforestation, as Ryan mentioned, and particularly the maturation of forest. And one of the images you saw there of mature forest plantation is essentially it's hen harriers don't use it, so they do nest in young forest plantation, but once the canopy closes over after about 10 to 12 years, it essentially the birds no longer use it, so either for foraging or for nesting. So that is one of the main pressures acting on hen harrier populations, and a substantial portion of the SPA network is under forest. So over half of the surface area of the SPA network, over 50% is under forest. So that's one of the main pressures acting on hen harrier populations, but also there are others such as predation, loss of other habitat, other pressures in the uplands such as wind energy development. So that really shows the importance of capturing that information as well at the sites you'll be covering, and it also shows the importance of carrying out a national survey, because obviously there can be quite substantial changes in the national population over that 5-year period or even more, the gap between the last survey in 2015 and while the population has been really well monitored in the SPA network through the Hen Harrier Project. We don't have the information outside of the SPA network isn't as good. So it's going to be really interesting to see what, the trends in numbers in populations outside the SPA network, and that, and hopefully, at the end of the summer, we'll have a good picture of that.
Excellent. Ryan, do you want to just flash that data submission page up there maybe and chat through that?
Yeah, sure. So there's the irishhenharriersurvey.com, and if you go to the tab on the homepage, data submission, you can scroll down. We do hope to update some of the maps as the survey progresses, but you can quite clearly see the comparisons there for your own reference. If you just scroll down on that page, there's a whole section about data entry, survey maps and recording forms. If you have hard copies to post, here's the addresses and the email addresses of Mark, John and myself. You can also download the digital forms and Excel spreadsheets. You can email us with any queries, but the most important thing is the online data form. And if you have a casual Hen Harrier sighting, you click on this one. There. And this is just a really simple pro form. I just put in some basic information, your email, type of survey, and it's got an interactive map where you can zoom in, click and select your location, a bit more details about behaviour, and then click submit. It's as simple as that for a casual sighting. For the survey form, it's obviously a bit more involved. You can just go to the online data portal, click on this open in browser. It's very similar. It's essentially an online pro forma of the recording form you're filling in. So fill the information in, set some pressures, again an interactive map for your grid references, behaviours, habitat codes, additional species, grid reference and additional notes, and then click submit. So even though there's an awful lot of information, it's a damn sight quicker than working through a paper form. So, and with a bit of practice, it will become just second nature, hopefully. Is that okay, Mark?
Yeah, brilliant. I think the top tab was then just to download the method statements and the recording forms as well. So it's all available on that data submission page. So and there is other information there about the previous surveys and what have you as well, if people are looking for that. So there's a good list of methodologies, your timings, all the stuff that Ryan had spoken through in the presentation, the threat codes, behaviors, habitats, etc., and the hard copy paper forms as well for printing off if that's what you wish to use. So I think that's pretty much us closed off. We're 10 minutes over. We'll leave the chat open for another 5 minutes maybe. I'll see there's one other questions come in there from just about casual observations are on both forms. It's just whether or not, depends on the type of sighting that you've had, as to whether or not it's a fixed vantage point that you've been doing. The casual observations, you can submit it either through the first form, which is for casual observations only, or you can submit a casual observation through the main recording form. Either is fine. And it just depends on whether or not you made an observation perhaps in the car on the way somewhere, or something not during a fixed or a timed vantage point watch. And it's just trying to gauge what effort people are actually spending. So the information on effort is actually quite important as to how much time is spent on the survey as well. So we'll close off the questions now. We'll leave the chat room open for another couple of minutes. The map is higher up in